All right, welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today, we're taking a look at a thinker known for his, really ingenious paradoxes. Zeno of Elea, 5th century BCE. But, and this is important for us, and as philosophers, I think, we're not just going to sort of like skim the surface of these puzzles. We're going to try to see Zeno's ideas as they were understood when they were brand new, in his own time, before all the centuries of, responses and interpretations were piled on.
Right. So kind of like, let's put aside calculus and modern physics for a minute. We're interested in the raw, almost unsettling power of Zeno's arguments against, well, first off, motion. He argued against the possibility of motion. And then also just the whole idea that there are many things. Now, this wasn't just some intellectual game. This was a serious engagement with the foundations of reality and knowledge as those things were understood by Zeno and his contemporaries.
And to really get into that headspace, I think we've got to turn to Plato's Parmenides, because it gives us this, snapshot of a really specific moment. It was when Zeno visited Athens with his mentor, Parmenides. So you've got Parmenides, who's 65 years old, a well-established fudger, and Zeno, coming up on 40, presenting these radical ideas. And then there's Socrates, who's only 20, just starting out, right? I mean, talk about a philosophical all-star team.
And what really blows my mind is how quickly Zeno's ideas seeped into the culture at large. I mean, we actually have a red figure drinking cup from the middle of the 5th century BCE. And get this, it shows a race between this heroic figure and a tortoise. It's very likely an early reference to Zeno's Achilles paradox. So clearly, these ideas, these super abstract arguments made their way into the mainstream pretty darn fast.
So the mission for us in this deep dive is to unpack Zeno's main arguments against plurality, the idea that there are lots of different things, and motion, too, the possibility of motion. So by doing that, we'll see how he thought he'd uncovered these big contradictions in our most basic assumptions about how the world works, the world we experience every day.
All right, so let's dive into these contradictions, starting with his critique of plurality, the idea that there are many things. Now, the first argument we're going to look at, actually, the only one we have in what seems to be its original wording, that has to do with the concepts of limited and unlimited. Now, we owe this direct quotation to Simplicius. He quotes it in his commentary on Aristotle's Physics.
And what's the contradiction that Zeno points out here? What's he getting at?
Basically, he argues that if there actually are lots of different things, a multiplicity of things that leads to a really weird contradiction, those things have to be both finite and infinite. In number, I mean. And here's how he puts it. If there are many things, it is necessary that they be just so many as they are, and neither greater than themselves nor fewer. But if they are just as many as they are, they will be limited. That first part makes sense, right? I mean, if you can count a number of things, there's got to be a limit to how many there are.
Yeah, I mean, if we can count them, there's got to be an end somewhere.
Right.
Right.
But then here comes the philosophical haymaker. Zeno continues, if there are many things, the things that are unlimited. For there are always others between these entities, and again others between those, and thus the things that are unlimited. So this is where things get really interesting. This whole idea of many starts to kind of break down when you look at it philosophically.
So how does he get to that idea of the unlimited, I mean?
Well, in our reconstruction of the argument, it hinges on this key assumption that distinct things, distinct entities have to be separate.
Right.
If you say there are many things, they can't all be squeezed into a single point. They got to be separated somehow. But for them to be separated, there's got to be something in between them.
Right. Think of any two separate objects right now. Because they're distinct, there's a gap, a space, even if it's super tiny, that sets them apart.
So even if it's just an incredibly small space, there's still something that's in between.
Exactly. But then those two separating somethings, they become separate entities themselves. So there needs to be yet another separation between them. And then between those separations and so on. It just keeps going infinitely. Acknowledging multiple distinct things seems to create this never-ending chain of stuff in between them.
It's like even if you think you've got the two closest points imaginable, you can always stick another point between them. In your mind, at least. Exactly. It's built into the very concept of many. That's what leads to an infinite number of things. So we end up with a contradiction. The many has to be limited because, they are just so many. But it also has to be unlimited because the idea of distinctness demands this infinite chain of stuff in between. It's a real head-scratcher.
Yeah, a super unsettling paradox. Right at the heart of how we think about, just multiplicity.
Yeah.
So that was the antinomy of the limited and unlimited. What's the next one? The next contradiction he finds with this idea of many things.
So next up, we have this antinomy about the large and the small. Simplicius has this one too, lucky for us. Here, Zeno says that if there are many things, those things have to be both infinitely large and have absolutely no size at all.
Hold on. No size whatsoever. How does he even start to argue for that? That's wild.
Well, he begins with what seems like a pretty straightforward idea, that each of the many is the same as itself, and one. Okay, now think of anything that actually has size, any object with dimensions. Just by being extended in space, we can imagine chopping it up into parts,
Right.
dividing it up. But if something's divisible, it can't be completely the same as itself everywhere. Think of any object with size. Different parts of it take up different spots.
So Zeno's saying if something has size, it can't be perfectly like one unified thing. It's got to have differences within itself.
Exactly. So if each of these many things is truly one and perfectly the same as itself, it can't have any size at all, because size means you can divide it up, and then it's not this perfectly unified thing anymore. It's got different parts.
Okay, I can follow that. Even if it seems a little weird, like not how we usually think about the world. But then how does he jump to the idea that these same many things are infinitely large?
Okay, so the second part of this antinomy hinges on a kind of unspoken assumption. It's like, if something has absolutely no size, it would basically be nothing.
Right.
Non-existent. And since we're assuming that there are these many things, each of them has to have some size. Now, if something does have size, it's got to be made up of parts.
Right.
And each of those parts must also have some size. Otherwise, the whole thing wouldn't have any size.
Like an infinite regress.
Yeah.
But like going downwards,
Mhm.
smaller and smaller.
Exactly. And we can keep dividing those parts up forever. Each part has size, so each part has more parts that have size, and so on. No end in sight. So each of the original many things ends up being made of an infinite number of parts, each with some tiny bit of size. But if you add up an infinite number of things, even really small things, you get infinity, an unlimited size.
So these many things
Mhm.
are like both infinitesimally small and infinitely large at the same time. Another huge contradiction just from saying that there are multiple things.
You got it.
Yeah.
And these arguments against the very idea of many really force us to rethink what it means for things to be separate and to have size, to take up space, you know?
Okay, so let's shift gears now and look at his famous paradoxes of motion. And for those, we're mostly going off of Aristotle's physics.
The paradoxes, the ones that have messed with people's minds for like thousands of years. Where do we even begin with those?
So Aristotle lays out four main paradoxes of motion that we can attribute to Zeno. The first one's usually called the stadium, or sometimes the dichotomy. And the main idea here is that to travel any distance, you got to first reach the halfway point. But before you can reach that, you got to reach the halfway point of that half, and so on and so on. You end up with an infinite series of points that you have to cross, one after the other. So basically an unlimited number of tiny distances to cover, each one taking some amount of time.
Right. And Aristotle points out in his physics, Zeno's basically saying you can't do an infinite number of things in a limited amount of time. Think about crossing a stadium. First, you got to cover half the distance, then half of what's left, which is a quarter of the whole thing, then half of that, which is an eighth, and so on forever. You can always cut the remaining distance in half.
So you end up with this infinite sequence of smaller and smaller distances, and each one takes a little bit of time to cross, but there's an infinite number of them.
Exactly. And since doing an infinite number of things, even if they get super tiny, would seem to take forever, Zeno's saying it's impossible to actually move that whole distance across the stadium. Now, he's not necessarily saying that people don't cross stadiums, in real life, but he's pointing out that it doesn't seem possible given the way we think about space being infinitely divisible.
A real mind bender, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It makes you question how we even think about space and time and movement. Okay, so what's Zeno's second paradox of motion?
So, the second one, maybe the most famous one, is the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. The idea is that Achilles, the super speedy runner, is racing a tortoise. But he gives the tortoise a head start. And Zeno's argument, get this, is that Achilles can never overtake the tortoise.
Even though Achilles is so much faster, that doesn't seem right.
Right, it's crazy. But here's the logic. By the time Achilles gets to where the tortoise started, the tortoise, slow as it is, has already moved a little bit further ahead. So Achilles then has to cover that extra distance, but by the time he does, the tortoise has moved ahead again a little bit more. And Zeno's saying this goes on forever. Every time Achilles catches up to where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved ahead a bit more, even if it's a tiny amount.
So the distance between them keeps getting smaller and smaller, but there's always a little bit left. The tortoise always has a lead, even if it's, like, microscopic.
Yep. There's always a tiny bit more distance that Achilles has to cover to actually catch up. And during that time, the tortoise is going to move ahead, even if just a hair. So, according to Zeno, Achilles can never actually catch up. Aristotle actually thought this was like a variation of the dichotomy paradox. It doesn't explicitly involve cutting distances in half, but it's got that same idea of an infinite series of things you got to do before you reach your goal.
It's like one of those thought experiments where the logic seems perfect, but it just feels wrong based on, like, what we actually see.
Yeah.
So what about the third paradox? What's he got for us there?
Okay, so the third one is the paradox of the arrow. Aristotle tells us Zeno's argument is that a moving arrow is actually motionless.
Wait, an arrow flying through the air, but completely still. How does that even work?
All right, so the argument goes like this. Picture the arrow at any single moment during its flight, like a snapshot, frozen in time, what Zeno might have called the now. At that exact moment, the arrow is taking up a space that's exactly the same size as the arrow itself. It's not sticking out past its own edges, and it's not leaving any gaps within its own length.
So if you freeze time, the arrow looks like it's standing still.
Right. And if you pick any other moment during the arrow's flight, the same logic applies. At every single instant, frozen in time, the arrow is taking up a space that's exactly its own size. So it's at rest in that moment. And if it's at rest at every single moment, then Zeno concludes that it must be motionless during the whole flight. The continuous movement we see is just an illusion. It's actually broken down into a zillion static moments. And if you add up a bunch of static moments, you still get something static.
I'm starting to see why these paradoxes cause such a stir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so what about the fourth paradox, the last one Aristotle tells us about?
Ah, that's the paradox of the moving rows. And this one, honestly, is the hardest to figure out exactly because Aristotle's description is kind of vague. He talks about these 3 rows of stuff in a stadium, all the same size. One row, let's call it AA, is stationary. The other 2 rows, BB and CC, are moving in opposite directions at the same speed. Row BB is moving from the middle of row AA and row CC from the end of row A, so they pass by each other.
Sounds like we're setting up a pretty complicated geometry problem.
Yeah, it's tricky. So Aristotle says that Zeno then claims this leads to this wild conclusion. Half the time is equal to double the time. And it seems like the logic goes something like this. Think about how long it takes one of the objects in row B to pass a certain number of objects in row A. In that same amount of time, that same object in row B will have passed a different number of objects in row C because row C is moving too.
Right, so comparing the time it takes to pass a certain number of objects, depending on if they're moving or not, seems to lead to this crazy conclusion that half the time is the same as double the time. But, and this is crucial, this only works if we assume that an object moving at a certain speed takes the same amount of time to pass a stationary object as it does to pass a moving object of the same size.
So the paradox comes from how we measure time and distance when things are moving relative to each other. Exactly. Now, Aristotle himself, he pokes holes in this argument. He points out that there might be a problem with saying speeds are the same when you're looking at different moving frames of reference, but we don't know for sure exactly how Zeno phrased the original argument. We only have, these fragments from Aristotle. Still, like the other paradoxes, the point is to show that there are these weird inconsistencies in how we usually think about motion when you analyze it logically.
Yeah. These paradoxes definitely give you a lot to think about. Okay, so now let's talk about what Zeno was trying to do with these really mind-bending arguments. A lot of people think he was mainly trying to defend Parmenides' monism, the idea that everything is ultimately one and you can't divide it up. How accurate is that interpretation, though?
Well, even though that's become the textbook answer, if you look at the evidence, especially from Plato's Parmenides, the picture's a little more complicated. In the dialogue, Socrates, young Socrates, that is, he initially interprets Zeno's arguments against plurality, his whole not many thing, as basically saying the same thing as Parmenides the one. He thinks Zeno's just trying to be original by flipping it around.
So Socrates thought Zeno was just restating the same idea in reverse.
Yeah, exactly. But Zeno himself says, no way, that's not what I'm doing. He says his work was intended as a kind of defense for Parmenides' philosophy. But he wasn't trying to convince people who already agreed with Parmenides. He was going after the people who were making fun of Parmenides' ideas because they thought those ideas had all these absurd consequences. So what Zeno does is he shows that the pluralist view, the belief in many things, leads to even more paradoxical and contradictory outcomes when you really think about it logically.
So he's not necessarily saying Parmenides is definitely right. He's more like, hey, if you think his ideas are crazy, look at where yours lead.
Exactly. It's like a you think that's bad, check this out kind of move. And it's not clear that Zeno's totally on board with every single aspect of Parmenides' philosophy. He's more using these weird conclusions from the pluralist view to make Parmenides look better by comparison.
So he's more focused on taking down the opposition than on, like, building up a specific positive theory of his own.
Right. And in fact, Jonathan Barnes, the philosopher, he's even suggested that Zeno's main goal was to troll the people making fun of Parmenides, like to shock them and throw them off balance. Not necessarily to like give a super serious, watertight defense of monism. And if you look at how Plato portrays Zeno, he paints him as this argumentative, victory-loving guy in his youth. So maybe some of his motivation was just like youthful enthusiasm for a good debate.
Which brings us to this whole tradition of anti-logic, right?
Yeah.
The art of, like, building contradictory arguments. That was a big thing with the sophists, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, for sure. Plato, in dialogues like the Alcibiades and the Phaedrus, he links Zeno to that eristic way of arguing, where the goal is to win the argument, even if you have to make the weaker argument look stronger. And get this, Aristotle, in a dialogue that's been lost, he actually credits Zeno with inventing dialectic.
Crazy, right? But at the same time, Aristotle says that some of Zeno's arguments are heuristic because they start from premises that seem plausible but are actually messed up.
So even though people like Isocrates put Zeno in the same category as sophists like Protagoras and Gorgias, Zeno's project wasn't really about like questioning social norms and stuff like the sophists did.
Right, that's a big difference. However, you can't deny his influence on their style of arguing, especially that whole antilogic thing. Thinkers like Protagoras and Gorgias almost certainly got some ideas from Zeno's, paradoxical way of reasoning. And it's even possible that Pericles' whole intellectual circle was a way for Zeno's ideas to spread to those early sophists. So I guess the best way to sum up Zeno's goals is to say that he wasn't super focused on defending one specific metaphysical system. He was more interested in using paradoxes as these powerful tools to show us the weird contradictions in our everyday beliefs. The beliefs we have about how the world works, especially when it comes to many things and to motion. He was kind of a proto-sophist in a way, even though those labels came later.
Totally. And it's amazing that these arguments, which don't use any super advanced math, have had such a huge impact on Western thought. Zeno used simple concepts, but he pushed them to their absolute limits. And in doing so, he introduced ideas like, limits and limitlessness, quantitative ideas that were brand new back then. It's possible he got some of those ideas from the Pythagoreans, but, historians still debate that.
And that whole intellectual energy, that really affected how Greek philosophy developed, right?
Oh, absolutely. Zeno brought up this whole problem of like infinite divisibility. That had a huge impact on later thinkers, guys like Anaxagoras and the atomists. And even though they came up with different solutions to the problems Zeno raised, they were still dealing with those problems. And Zeno's arguments also played a big role in how Aristotle developed his own ideas about continuity, space, and motion. Basically, Zeno forced the Greek philosophers who were thinking about nature to like level up, to go beyond just common sense and come up with more rigorous and sophisticated theories about the physical world, because they had to address the challenges Zeno threw at them.
And the fact that mathematicians and physicists are still arguing about these paradoxes today shows how powerful they are.
Totally. When we try to wrap our heads around Zeno's paradoxes, it makes us question our most basic ideas about physics and math. It's entirely possible that Zeno's whole point was just to make us think more critically about those ideas. And in doing so, he invented philosophical methods like, reductio ad absurdum that we still use today, essential tools of the trade.
So in this deep dive, we've gone through Zeno's wild and challenging arguments, and we've seen how he pointed out this tension between, like, our everyday understanding of how things work and these strange contradictions that pop up when we think about it harder. About motion and about whether there really are many things.
Which leaves us, as fellow philosophers, with a really interesting question to chew on. If Zeno's right, if these challenges still matter today, what are we taking for granted? What assumptions do we have about space, time, and reality itself that we haven't really examined? And what if we took inspiration from Zeno's, his rigorous and maybe even argumentative style to dig into those assumptions? Could that lead us to new philosophical discoveries? It's something to think about as we wrap things up here.
It certainly is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.